Water needs a road. Every field on every slope in every county in the Midwest produces runoff when it rains. The water that doesn't infiltrate has to go somewhere, and somewhere is downhill. If the water has a road, a grass channel, smooth and wide, shaped like the bottom of a canoe, seated in dense brome or fescue that slows the flow and filters the sediment and absorbs the energy of the moving water, the runoff leaves the field in an orderly way. It enters the waterway at the top of the slope. It travels through the grass at a controlled velocity, 1 to 2 feet per second, instead of the 5 to 8 feet per second that bare soil channels produce. The grass bends under the flow, forming a flexible mat that absorbs the energy, traps the soil particles, and releases the water into the ditch at the bottom of the field, clean enough that the ditch doesn't erode and the creek doesn't silt, and the farmer's topsoil stays on the field where it was deposited by the last ice age. If the water doesn't have a road, if the grassed waterway has been plowed out, planted to corn, converted from a drainage channel to a crop row, the water makes its own road. And the road the water makes is called a gully. A gully is a wound in the earth. It starts as a rill, a pencil-width channel, no deeper than a fingernail. The rill carries water, and the water deepens the rill, and the rill becomes a channel, and the channel becomes a ditch, and the ditch becomes a gully, and the gully becomes a trench, 3 or 4 feet deep and 10 feet wide, that cuts through the field like a knife through a cake, exposing the yellow clay subsoil beneath the topsoil, swallowing 6 or 8 or 12 rows of corn that had been planted where the waterway used to be, and carrying the farmer's topsoil and fertilizer and herbicide and corn plants into the creek in a chocolate-brown torrent that represents hundreds of dollars per acre in damage and years of recovery, and the particular regret of a man who plowed out a waterway to gain 30 feet of corn and lost 30 feet of field instead. In Schuyler County, Missouri, the small county in the northeast corner of the state, population 4,300. The kind of place where every farmer knows every other farmer's planting decisions, because the county is small enough that a man driving to town passes every field in the township. The grass waterways were built by the Soil Conservation Service between 1955 and 1980. The SCS surveyed the drainage patterns, identified the natural concentration points where runoff converged on the slopes, and constructed grassed waterways at those points, shaped channels 20 to 40 feet wide, seeded in Kentucky, 31 fescue or smooth bromegrass, designed to carry the 10-year storm event without erosion. The waterways were the drainage infrastructure for the crop fields, the roads that the water used to leave the field without destroying the field on the way out. Then the waterways were plowed out, and the reasons were the same reasons that drove every conservation loss in American agriculture between 1996 and 2015. The price of corn, the price of soybeans, and the number of acres between 2006 and 2014. When corn averaged $5.25 per bushel and soybeans averaged $11.50, every acre mattered. A grass waterway, 30 feet wide, running 1,200 feet, through a field occupied approximately 0.83 acres. 0.83 acres of fescue, producing 0 bushels of corn on ground that could produce 175 bushels at $5.25 per bushel, $919 per year in forgone revenue. A farm with 3 waterways surrendered $2,757 per year. A farm with 6 waterways surrendered $5,514. The surrender was visible in the green strips of grass running through the gold of the corn. Visible from the county road, visible from the tractor seat, visible in the aerial photos that the FSA used for compliance checks and that every farmer studied to calculate the exact acreage he was farming and the exact acreage the waterways were wasting. The plowing started gradually. A farmer would narrow the waterway from 30 feet to 20, planting the outside edges to corn. The waterway still functioned at 20 feet. It carried the normal rain events without problems. Then the farmer would narrow it to 15 feet, then 10. Then the farmer would look at the remaining 10-foot strip of grass running through his field and decide that 10 feet wasn't worth the headland turns and the planter adjustments and the combines maneuvering around a strip of grass that produced nothing, and he'd plow through it. The waterway would vanish. The field would go fence to fence, every row planted, every acre cropped. The drainage pattern that the SCS had surveyed in 1962, still there in the topography, but no longer there in the management. The water that used to have a road now had bare corn rows. And the next heavy rain would prove why the road had been built. In Schuyler County, approximately 35% of the grass waterways that existed in 1990 had been plowed out by 2015, removed, narrowed to non-functional width, or neglected until the grass died and the channel silted shut. The removal was concentrated on the larger operations. The farms that had expanded acreage during the boom and that counted every fractional acre of corn, because the fractional acres added up to the margin that made the expansion pencil out. There was one farmer in the county who didn't plow his waterways. His name was Russell Hegmire. He farmed 480 acres outside of Glenwood, a crossroads so small it doesn't have a post office, just a church and a gravel road, and the kind of quiet that makes a man think clearly about what water does when it hits his field. Russell's farm had 5 grass waterways, built by the SCS in 1965, each one 30 feet wide, running from the upper slopes down to the drainage ditch that bordered his south property line. The waterways totaled approximately 4.2 acres. 4.2 acres of smooth bromegrass that Russell mowed once per year in late July, after the nesting birds had fledged. The clippings left in place as mulch, the grass thick and dense and rooted 3 feet deep into the clay subsoil, 4.2 acres. At $5.25 corn and 175 bushels per acre, the waterways cost Russell approximately $3,859 per year in foregone crop revenue, on a 480-acre farm grossing approximately $378,000 per year in corn and soybeans. The waterway cost was 1% of gross income, a small number in absolute terms, a large number in the minds of the neighbors who counted every acre and saw those 5 green strips of bromegrass as money lying on the ground. Russell Hegmire is growing grass in his crop fields, 5 waterways, 4 acres of bromegrass, right in the middle of corn ground. That's $3,800 per year. He's mowing instead of harvesting. The rest of us plowed through our waterways 5 years ago, and we're harvesting every acre. Russell's mowing his income. The mowing his income line was what the elevator used against Russell, and it stung because it was mathematically true. Russell was mowing 4.2 acres that could grow corn. The $3,800 was real money. The neighbors who had plowed their waterways were making $3,800 more per year. Or, more accurately, they were collecting $3,800 more per year, because the distinction between making and collecting would become important later. Now, let me tell you about what Russell understood that the elevator didn't, because Russell's decision to keep his waterways wasn't about aesthetics or tradition or the SCS program that had paid for them 50 years ago. Russell's decision was about physics, the physics of water on a slope, which doesn't change when the price of corn changes. Russell's farm sat on a 3 to 5% slope, moderate by Schuyler County standards, enough gradient that a 4-inch rain produced significant runoff, not enough to make the land obviously vulnerable. The soil was Putnam silt loam, the same claypan soil that covered most of northeast Missouri. The same soil that had an infiltration rate of approximately 0.6 to 0.8 inches per hour, and that produced substantial runoff in any rain event that exceeded 1 inch per hour. On Russell's 480 acres, a 2-inch rain produced approximately 400,000 gallons of runoff. Water that had to go somewhere, and that somewhere was either through the grass waterways at a controlled velocity or through the bare corn rows at an uncontrolled velocity. The waterways handled the controlled exit. Each waterway was designed to carry the runoff from approximately 80 to 100 acres of watershed. The contributing area that drained to that point in the landscape. The 30-foot width and the dense bromegrass sod were engineered to carry the 10-year storm, approximately 4.5 inches of rain in 24 hours in northeast Missouri, without erosion. The grass slowed the water, the roots held the soil, the channel shape spread the flow across the full 30-foot width, preventing the concentration that creates gullies. The water entered the waterway brown and left the waterway cleaner, the sediment trapped in the grass. The energy absorbed by the vegetation, the field's topsoil staying on the field. Russell's father, Edwin, had explained the engineering to Russell in 1988, when Russell took over the farm. Edwin had been one of the first farmers in the county to participate in the SCS program, enrolling in 1965, the year the county conservationist had surveyed the farm and identified the 5 drainage concentration points where waterways were needed. Edwin had watched the waterways being built, the bulldozer shaping the channels, the seed drill planting the brome, the grass establishing over 2 years until the waterways were thick enough to carry runoff without eroding. "Those waterways cost me 4 acres of corn," Edwin told Russell. "They gained me 476 acres of topsoil. The corn on 4 acres is worth $3,800 per year. The topsoil on 476 acres is worth more than the farm. The waterways are the cheapest soil insurance I've ever bought." Edwin's logic was simple and unassailable, but the simplicity was its weakness. Simple logic loses to complex incentives, and the incentive to plow the waterways was complex, involving commodity prices, operating loan requirements, land rental competition, and the particular psychology of a farmer who can see the grass strip from his tractor seat and calculate, with every pass, exactly how much that strip is costing him. Russell kept the waterways because he trusted Edwin's logic the way sons trust fathers who've been right about things that take 30 years to prove. The waterways hadn't been tested by a major rain event since 1993, a 24-year gap between the last significant flood and the year when the test arrived. 24 years is long enough for a lesson to fade. 24 years is long enough for the county to forget why the waterways were built and to start counting the acres they occupy instead of the acres they protect. Now, let me tell you about the night of May 1st, 2017, because the storm that hit Schuyler County that night was the event that the SCS had designed the waterways to survive and that the plowed-out fields were naked to face. The National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for Schuyler County at 8:47 p.m. on May 1st, 2017. A training thunderstorm complex, multiple cells moving over the same geography in succession, each one dropping heavy rain on ground that the previous cell had already saturated, stalled over the county between 7 p.m. and midnight. The rain gauge at the Glenwood Cooperative Observer Station recorded 6.8 inches in 5 hours, an intensity that exceeded the 25-year storm event for the region. The rain fell in 2 pulses, 3.2 inches, between 7:30 and 9:30 p.m., a 45-minute lull, then 3.6 inches between 10:15 p.m. and midnight. The first pulse saturated the soil. The second pulse ran off. 6.8 inches on claypan soil with an infiltration rate of 0.7 inches per hour. The math was catastrophic. At 0.7 inches per hour infiltration, the soil could absorb approximately 3.5 inches of the 6.8 inches of rainfall. The remaining 3.3 inches, approximately 89,000 gallons per acre, ran off the surface. On a 100-acre field, 8.9 million gallons of water had to leave the field. The question was how? Through a grassed waterway or through the corn? On the fields where the waterways had been plowed out, the water left through the corn. The runoff concentrated in the natural drainage lines, the low points in the topography where the waterways used to be, the points where the landscape funneled the water from the surrounding slopes into a single channel. But the channel was no longer grass. The channel was corn, 4-inch corn plants, just emerged, rooted in loose seedbed soil that the planter had created 3 weeks earlier. The loose soil offered no resistance. The corn plants offered no protection. The water concentrated, accelerated, and cut. The gullies that formed on the night of May 1st were the worst the county had seen since 1993. Farmers walked their fields on the morning of May 2nd and found trenches, 3 to 5 feet deep, 8 to 15 feet wide, running the length of the field where the waterways had been. The gullies followed the old drainage lines exactly. The topography hadn't changed when the waterways were plowed out. The water still flowed to the same low points. The water still concentrated at the same convergent zones. The only thing that had changed was the surface. Grass had been replaced by corn seedlings and bare soil couldn't carry 8.9 million gallons per 100 acres without being destroyed. The gullies cut through the topsoil and into the subsoil, the yellow Putnam clay that lay beneath 10 to 14 inches of dark silt loam. The exposed subsoil was sterile, compacted, and essentially unfarmable without years of amendment. The gullies consumed corn rows, 6 to 12 rows per gully, depending on width, the corn plants washed out or buried under sediment deposits at the bottom of the slope. The sediment, the farmer's topsoil, carrying his nitrogen and his pre-emergence herbicide and his organic matter, deposited in the drainage ditch at the south end of the fields, blocking culverts, flooding the county road, and continuing downstream into Fabius Creek, which ran brown for 4 days after the storm. The NRC's damage assessment, conducted the following week, estimated erosion losses on the fields without waterways at 25 to 45 tons per acre, 5 to 9 times the tolerable rate. On fields with intact waterways, erosion losses were estimated at 3 to 6 tons per acre, within or slightly above the tolerable rate. The difference was the waterway, the grassed channel that absorbed the energy, spread the flow, trapped the sediment, and allowed the water to leave the field without carving a trench through the farmer's topsoil. Russell Hegmire's Waterways held. The 5 bromegrass channels carried the May 1st storm the way they'd been carrying storms since 1965. The water entering at the top of the slope, spreading across the full 30-foot width of the grass, the flow slowing from a destructive velocity to a manageable one, the sediment filtering out of the water and depositing in the grass where it would decompose and feed the brome root system. The waterways ran full, water standing 6 to 8 inches deep in the grass channel, the brome bent flat by the flow but holding, the root mass gripping the soil beneath, the channel maintaining its shape under a load that would have destroyed any bare soil surface. Russell's fields had rills, small channels, an inch or two deep, running between the corn rows where the runoff had concentrated before reaching the waterway. The rills were normal, expected in a 6.8-inch rain, repairable with a single cultivation pass, the kind of minor surface damage that heals by midsummer and doesn't affect yield. His fields did not have gullies, not one. The waterways had intercepted every drainage concentration point on the 480 acres, and the water that reached those points had been channeled through grass instead of through bare soil. The morning of May 2nd, Russell drove his pickup along the county road that bordered the south side of his farm and the north side of Emmett Krause's farm. Emmett farmed 800 acres, a bigger operation, expanded during the boom, every waterway plowed out by 2010 to maximize corn acreage. Emmett's fields were visible from the road. The contrast was the kind that doesn't need explanation. Russell's fields, green brome waterways, visible as dark strips through the young corn, the field surface intact, the topsoil in place, the rills minor and manageable. Emmett's fields, 3 gullies visible from the road, raw wounds in the earth, yellow subsoil exposed, the corn washed out in the gully zones, sediment fans at the bottom of each slope where the runoff had deposited its load. The gullies ran exactly where the waterways had been before Emmett plowed them out in 2009 and 2010. The topography hadn't forgotten the drainage pattern. The topography never forgets. Now let me tell you about the cost, because the financial impact of the May 1st storm on fields without waterways was measured in dollars that made the $3,800 per year of foregone corn revenue look like pocket change. The gully repair on Emmett's farm required a dozer, a scraper, and 3 days of earthwork. Filling the gullies with subsoil from the field edges, grading the surface smooth, and recompacting the fill to prevent settlement. The earthwork cost $8,400. The replanting cost, reseeding the gullied areas with corn, at a late planting date that would reduce yield on the replanted acres by 20 to 30%, $2,200. The topsoil loss, permanent, unrepairable, was estimated by the NRCS at approximately 2 inches on the gully slopes, reducing the long-term yield potential on those acres by 6 to 10%. A permanent cost of approximately $40 to $70 per acre per year on the 18 acres directly affected by the gullies. The herbicide loss, the pre-emergence herbicide that was carried off the field in the runoff, required reapplication on approximately 60 acres at $22 per acre, $1,320. The nitrogen loss, the anhydrous ammonia that leached from the disturbed soil in the gully zones, required supplemental application on approximately 40 acres at $35 per acre, $1,400. Total storm damage on Emmett's farm, $13,320 in immediate repair and replanting costs, plus approximately $900 to $1,260 per year in permanent yield reduction on the gullied acres on a single night from a single storm. The $3,800 per year that Emmett had gained by plowing his waterways was consumed by one storm's damage in a ratio of 3.5 to 1, 3.5 years of extra corn revenue wiped out in 5 hours of rain, and the damage compounded. The gullies that formed on May 1st would reform in the next heavy rain if the drainage pattern wasn't addressed. Filling the gullies with a dozer repaired the surface, but didn't solve the problem. The problem was that the water still concentrated at the same points and still needed a road to leave the field. Without a waterway, the road the water made would be another gully in the same place during the next 4-inch rain. The repair was temporary. The solution was permanent. The solution was the waterway that Emmett had plowed out 7 years earlier. Now let me tell you about Emmett Krause, because the man who farmed fence to fence drove to Russell's farm on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks after the storm and stood at the edge of Russell's North Waterway and said something that the co-op would repeat for years. Emmett was 48 years old, lean, weathered, the kind of farmer who made decisions with a pencil and stood by them. He'd plowed his waterways with full knowledge of what they were and what they did. He'd weighed the $3,800 per year in forgone revenue against the risk of erosion and decided that the revenue was more important. The decision had been correct for 7 years. The decision had been catastrophic for one night, and the one night had erased the 7 years and then some. Russell, Emmett, your waterways held. They held. They've held every rain since 1965. That's what they're for. I plowed mine out in 2009 and 2010, gained 3.8 acres of corn, $3,800 per year for 7 years, $26,600 in extra revenue. The storm cost me $13,320 in repairs and replanting. I've got $900 a year in permanent yield loss on the gullied acres. In 3 years, the yield loss eats the remaining $13,280 of the 7 years of extra revenue. In 5 years, I'm in the red. I plowed the waterways to make money. I'm going to lose money because I plowed the waterways. You plowed the roads that the water needed. The water made its own roads. The water's roads are more expensive than yours. I need to put them back. You need to put them back. What does it cost? When my father built them in 1965, The SCS paid 75%. The cost was about $400 per waterway. Shaped channel, seeded, established. Today, if you can get EQIP cost share, the government pays 50%. The total cost to rebuild a waterway, dozer shaping, topsoil replacement over the gully fill, seeding, mulching, is approximately $2,500 to $3,500 per waterway. You had three, so $7,500 to $10,500. Less if you get cost share. $10,500 to rebuild what I destroyed for $3,800 per year. $10,500 to rebuild, plus the $13,320, the storm cost, plus the $900 per year you'll lose forever on the gullied ground. The waterways cost $3,800 per year to maintain as grass. The gullies cost $13,320 to repair once and $900 per year in yield loss permanently. The waterway is cheaper than the gully every year for the rest of your farming career. Emmett stood at the waterway, the 30-foot strip of bromegrass, thick green, the grass growing vigorously in May, the root system visible at the channel edge, where the storm water had undercut the sod slightly. The waterway had worked. The waterway had been working for 52 years. The waterway would work for another 52 years if someone mowed it once a year and left the grass alone. I looked at this grass every year from the tractor seat and calculated what it was costing me. Emmett said, 30 feet of brome in the middle of my corn. I calculated $919 per waterway per year. I never calculated what the waterway was saving me. I calculated the cost of the grass. I never calculated the cost of not having the grass. Nobody calculates the cost of not having the grass until the storm provides the calculation. The storm is the invoice. The invoice always costs more than the insurance. Now, let me tell you about the seed dealer, because the man who sold Emmett his corn seed and his soybeans had been encouraging fence-to-fence planting for a decade. More acres, more seed sales, more revenue for the dealership, and the storm forced a reckoning that seed dealers don't usually have. The dealer's name was Kevin Knorr. He ran Knorr Ag Services out of Lancaster, the nearest town with a stoplight, 12 miles south of Glenwood. Kevin had been farming's biggest cheerleader during the boom. Plant every acre. Corn is $7. Every acre you don't plant is $919 you're leaving on the table. The waterways are wasted ground. Plow them and plant them. Kevin had sold seed to Emmett for the acres that Emmett gained by plowing the waterways. Kevin's commission on those additional 3.8 acres of corn seed and soybean seed was approximately $85 per year. The gully damage on Emmett's farm was $13,320. Kevin's commission on the waterway acres over 7 years, $595. The ratio of damage to commission was 22 to 1. Kevin drove to Russell's farm on a Wednesday evening in late May. He found Russell mowing the North Waterway, the annual mowing, the Farmall 560, pulling a 7-foot rotary cutter through the bromegrass, the clippings flying behind the mower, the grass already thick from the spring rain that had caused the flood. The waterway that had saved Russell's field was being maintained with a $6 mowing that took 45 minutes. Russell, Kevin, I've been telling my customers to plow their waterways for 8 years. I told them the grass was wasted ground. I calculated the seed revenue on those acres. I never calculated the gully damage if the waterways weren't there. The seed revenue is annual. The gully damage is permanent. Annual revenue is a paycheck. Permanent damage is a scar. The scar doesn't heal. The yield loss on Emmett's gullied acres is there for the rest of his career and his children's career. The 2 inches of topsoil that washed into the creek on May 1st took 200 years to build. Emmett gained $26,600 in 7 years by plowing the waterway. He lost 200 years of topsoil in 5 hours. The trade doesn't balance. I need to stop telling people to plow waterways. You need to start telling people to build them. Kevin went quiet. He didn't stop selling seed. The market demanded seed, and the market demanded maximum acreage. And the market didn't have a line item for soil conservation. But Kevin stopped calculating waterway acres as potential seed sales. And when a customer mentioned plowing a waterway, Kevin said something he'd never said before, no? Something that a seed dealer probably shouldn't say, but that Kevin felt compelled to say after seeing Emmett's Gullies and Russell's intact fields on the same county road after the same storm. Leave the waterway. The acres aren't worth the gully. Now let me tell you about the rebuilding, because Emmett Krause rebuilt his waterways in the fall of 2017, all 3 from scratch, on the same drainage lines where they'd existed before he plowed them out. The NRCS provided 50% cost share through EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program that funded conservation practices on private land. Emmett applied in June, was approved in August, and had the waterways constructed in October. A dozer shaped the channels, 30 feet wide, the same width the originals had been, the grade set at 0.5% to carry water without scouring. The gully fills were covered with 4 inches of topsoil, hauled from a stockpile at the field edge. The channels were seeded with a smooth brome-tall fescue mix, a blend that established faster than pure brome and provided the dense sod that the waterways needed to carry runoff by the following spring. Total cost, $9,200. EQIP cost share, $4,600. Emmett's out of pocket, $4,600. The waterways would be functional by the spring of 2018, the grass established enough to carry moderate rain events by May. Fully established by the fall of 2018, capable of carrying the design storm by the spring of 2019. $4,600 out of pocket to rebuild what he'd destroyed for $3,800 per year. The waterways would cost $3,800 per year in forgone corn revenue going forward. The same $3,800 that had seemed like a burden in 2009 and that now seemed like the cheapest insurance in agriculture. $3,800 per year to prevent $13,320 in storm damage. $900 per year in permanent yield loss, and the topsoil that no amount of money could replace. Let me tell you about how this ends. Russell Hegmire is 62 years old. His son, Joel, works the 480 acres with him. The same 5 waterways, the same 30-foot bromegrass channels, the same annual mowing, the same $3,800 per year in forgone revenue that has protected 476 acres of cropland from gully erosion for 58 years. The waterways have survived every rain event the county has produced since 1965, including the 6.8-inch storm of 2017, which was the largest in the county's recorded history. The waterways did not gully. The waterways did not erode. The waterways carried the storm the way they were designed to carry it, and the fields on either side of the waterways emerged from the storm with their topsoil intact. The total cost of maintaining 5 waterways for 58 years, approximately $220,000 in forgone corn revenue, calculated at varying commodity prices over the period. The total erosion prevented, approximately 26,000 tons of topsoil that would have left the field through gullies had the waterways not been there. Calculated from the NRCS erosion estimates for unprotected fields in the same soil type and slope class. 26,000 tons of topsoil at an estimated value of $5 per ton in yield-producing capacity. The saved topsoil was worth approximately $130,000 in avoided yield loss. The math was close. $220,000 in foregone revenue against $130,000 in avoided yield loss. And the math didn't favor the waterways in pure dollars. But the math didn't include the gully repair costs that Russell never paid. The $13,000 to $15,000 per storm event that fields without waterways incurred every 5 to 8 years. Over 58 years, with approximately 8 significant storm events, the avoided gully repair cost was approximately $100,000 to $120,000. Added to the avoided yield loss, the total benefit of the waterways was approximately $230,000 to $250,000, slightly above the $220,000 in foregone revenue. The waterways paid for themselves over a 58-year career, not dramatically, not overwhelmingly. But the waterways paid, and the fields that didn't have waterways carried scars that would reduce their productivity for generations. The Farmel 5.6. Oh, that Edwin used to mow the waterways sits in the machine shed. Joel uses it for the same job. The annual July mowing, 45 minutes per waterway, $6 in diesel, the simplest maintenance on the farm. The mower cuts the grass grows back. The waterway carries the next storm. The field keeps its topsoil. The cycle is 58 years old and requires nothing except leaving the grass alone and mowing it once per year. Emmett Krause's rebuilt waterways are 7 years old now. The brome is thick. The channels carry water. The gullies haven't returned. Emmett lost approximately $26,600 in extra corn revenue over the 7 years he farmed the waterway acres. Paid $13,320 in storm damage, paid $4,600 to rebuild, and will lose approximately $900 per year in permanent yield reduction on the gullied acres for the rest of his farming career. The total cost of plowing out the waterways, approximately $44,000 in 12 years. The total revenue from the extra corn acres, $26,600. Net loss from plowing the waterways, approximately $17,400. $17,400. That's the cost of planting 3.8 acres of corn where 3.8 acres of grass used to be. That's the price of fence to fence. The co-op doesn't joke about Russell's waterways anymore. The men at the elevator remember May 1st, 2017. The 6.8 inches, the gullies, the yellow subsoil, the chocolate creek. They remember Russell's fields intact and Emmett's fields scarred. They remember the arithmetic that Emmett recited at the seed dealer's counter. 7 years of extra corn swallowed by 1 night of water. The flood took their fields. The grass saved his. That's the whole story. Subscribe to The Average Farmer for more. We'll see you in the next one.